All right, so we're starting a recording. Welcome everybody to our fourth session of the 50th anniversary Pilgrim at Tinker Creek Read Along. Thank you once again, everybody, for joining us. We're so happy to have you here today. Today, for our March 18th session, we've got guest guides Ashley and Thomas Fellers. Ashley's waving there at downtown. And they'll be helping us discuss chapters 9 through 11. And when I accidentally tabbed through to this earlier, I heard somebody remark on this really interesting picture that I found. I was looking for pictures from the flood of 85, because I figured maybe that would be sort of the best I don't know, I guess visual reference point for what's being described in the flood chapter. And I actually, via the city of Roanoke, they have like a sort of commemorative web page where you can scroll down and see a lot of interesting pictures, and then you can click on specific areas and what they looked like at the time. So this is actually Tinker Creek during that time. So I was really happy to find that. Sorry, I've got a chat message really quick. All right, so without further ado, everybody please welcome Ashley Wilson Fellers. I'll read her bio really quick and move on. Or Ashley, if you have anything you'd like to add, please feel free to jump in at any time. Ashley Wilson Fellers is an award-winning writer, visual artist, and photographer. Her features, creative nonfiction, photo essays, poetry, fiction, and paintings have appeared in a wide range of regional publications, like the Virginian Pilot and Roanoke Magazine, in business publications and in literary journals like Double Take, Points of Entry, Smoke Long Quarterly, Artemis, and Pensive, A Global Journey of Spirituality and the Arts. She has served as an editor, designed and taught curricula for college level study, and created website copy and marketing build-outs for small businesses. She's a Master of Fine Arts degree from Virginia Tech. Credible resume, bravo. And introducing our second guide, we have Thomas Fellers. Thomas Fellers serves as an associate broker at MKB Realtors, a Roanoke-based real estate firm. He advises and represents clients who make important decisions on housing and commercial real estate. Previously, Thomas worked as a director of sales for a regional home building company. He holds a Master of Arts degree in English Literature from Virginia Tech and a bachelor's in English from Christopher Newport University. Thomas currently serves as an advisor with Leadership Roanoke Valley and on the boards of the Roanoke Valley Association of Realtors, Community Youth Program, Blue Ridge Fellows, and the CNU Alumni Association Roanoke chapter. So we have two English Masters of Arts here. So we're in great hands this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys, if that's all good with you. We'll be starting with chapter 9, Flood.
Yep. Thank you, Natalia. Great introduction and nothing to add on those bios. They sounded pretty good.
We made ourselves sound great.
Listen, I mean, if it's honest,
Learn to be well enough. Don't mess with it. But no, this is great, and Ashley and I both went to Virginia Tech for grad school, and we had a chance to be in the halls around where Thomas Gardner was teaching at the time, and we didn't get a chance to take any classes with him. So it was really wonderful to have him launch the conversations, because we finally got to take his class.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And so we had to wait a long time, but we finally did. And so we're excited to jump into chapters 9, 10, and 11 with the group tonight. And we'll start with chapter 9, which is chapter Flood. And wanted to launch with this section from chapter 9, page 149, which I'll just read. It says, Tinker Creek is out of its 4-foot banks way out, and it's still coming. The high creek doesn't look like our creek. Our creek splashes transparently over a jumble of rocks. The high creek obliterates everything and flat opacity. It looks like somebody else's creek that has usurped or eaten our creek and is roving frantically to escape. Big and ugly, like a black snake caught in a kitchen drawer. So anyhow, that is a wonderful image that captures a really disconcerting disruption to what is maybe a familiar creek to the Roanoke area. And there are a lot of sections, I think, in this chapter, flood, which you can make the case that in all of her chapters, maybe it's unlike the other chapters, there's a lot of really kind of more familiar, place-based, almost kind of Roanoke-centric sensitivity. And I wanted to introduce, I guess, that concept for pondering. If flood is maybe one of the more recognizable chapters for its local landscapes and references to a specific flood in Roanoke, which in this case was Agnes, but Agnes was a nice little precursor to the photo that Natalie put up there with, I guess it was Juan, Hurricane Juan, I think it was for 85. The question, I guess, is did you all, when reading it, notice any events or people or places in the chapter that maybe were personally recognizable? When reading the chapter, did anything jump out to you as recognizable as a Roanoke resident, even if you weren't here when it was being documented?
Oh, I was.
And some people were.
Tell us more.
The hurricane came up the coast, but it was inland. I was in Virginia Beach that weekend, and here's the newspaper that says big flood in Roanoke.
Oh,
And when we came back through Richmond, we couldn't get through Richmond because everything had hit the James, and then Richmond was flooded. It wasn't nearly as bad as 85, but it was a very good flood for Roanoke. And we just lived like 2 or 3 blocks from where the stadium was, and so, you know, it was very close. Interesting.
How long did it take you to get back here?
We got back that same day, but you know, there were roads closed all over, snaking around, and part of 95 and 64 are lower, and some of them, part of it is higher in Richmond, and so we were lucky to get through some of the higher places and get home. But it was interesting to me to see the 72, but I thought, oh, been here, done that.
As always, anyone on Zoom, please feel free to chime in whenever. Just unmute and go ahead. But if you'd like to use the little hand raise, oh, Twyla, please go right ahead.
You might be muted, Twyla.
Yes, I was trying to figure that out. Sorry.
There you go.
This chapter, I noticed at the end that it does mention Governor Holton, and I guess it's specifically coming out of Richmond, the flood starting there at the James. And one thing I've found interesting of this chapter is that it mentions by name some of her neighbors. And I don't think up until this point, like she's calling out neighbors' yards by name and what was happening and how the landscape was unfolding into their gardens and their yards and in their basements. But I don't recall another chapter where she really got specific on her neighborhood. And, you know, usually when you're reading her chapters, it's a solo experience. So I don't know, this was interesting to me that it was like she was really branching out and connecting with her neighbors at this time.
That's a really great observation.
And
Really
I
great
tabbed
option.
over to the next slide because that's exactly what Ashley had written, pointing out the humanity. sort of focus of the chapter.
Well,
I think Jane is
I-
raising her hand.
I had a couple of visual things from that flood. My kids were out at community school and I was in Raleigh Court and I didn't know how they were going to get home because Tinker Creek was obviously flooding the roadways. So we were a little bit worried. I was driving around town with my youngest child and I couldn't get home because the low-lying roads were on the way home. And I'll never forget that Kroger's used to be where Hamrick's is now. And as we drove past there, there was a waterfall coming off that edge, the end of that parking lot. It was truly a waterfall. And then
Is it down Garth Mill Road? Is that Garth Mill?
towards that way, yes.
Oh my God.
And I remember going to a friend's house who was higher up, but watching the sewer covers float down in the stream of water. I mean, that's how strong the water was. That was just amazing to me still.
Wow.
Wow.
So floods are powerful.
Really quick, I just wanted to voice Katie's great observation. She writes, I really enjoyed the tale of the Bings redeemed flooded house and their mushroom meals. That was a really, really interesting little tale.
And I was gonna say that I appreciate when she puts these phrases in, like the blacksmith, the snake in the kitchen drawer. So this is beyond Roanoke, but I grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania, and when I came to Virginia Tech, people would ask me why I came to Virginia Tech. And I would say, because I read Gone with the Wind. And she has this reference of the Tarleton twins on thoroughbreds cantering away from the gates of Tara. So in some ways that touches a lot of people beyond Roanoke, but I think a comment like that draws you into the book a little further.
You know, I think the question about why is she driven to write such a human chapter, and that's because a flood is a very human event. I wasn't here in '85, but we had bought a little rental house and right on the river. And before it had closed, but after we had signed, the river's rising, it's halfway up the backyard. And, we're wondering what's going to happen. And the house didn't flood, but I did a lot of research on what happened with the flood of '85 and all of the work that was done to try and contain the river through all the bench cuts. Now, our house eventually did flood twice. From that river, we've since sold it. But so it's like that feeling of not being able to do anything. A lot of her book is about what she's able to do and observe and be a part of. A flood, you can't do shit, it is what it is, and you suffer the consequences of it. You are powerless of it. And so I think she kind of illustrates that through her writing.
And we were in the Shenandoah Valley in '85, sitting on the edge of the Shenandoah River in Port Republic, and flooded quite a bit. And that's you can't stop it. You just go through it.
I remember reading that when I was researching this, that Pennsylvania was one of the places most affected. I don't know if it was where you were, but that what we experienced here was felt in many places, including Pennsylvania. So that's wild. Yeah.
And you do have the neighbors coming out.
You do, you do.
And connecting.
Yeah, I grew up, so I wasn't here during either of the floods named in this book, but I grew up in the Tidewater area where there's quite a bit of flooding regularly in different parts of the geography, including every hurricane that ever comes through. And this was so recognizable to me that this is what you do when there's flooding. It's like you come out of your house when you can, and you meet all your neighbors and you bail them out as best you can. And a whole bunch of people get together and make coffee for everybody. And that's just what you do. And it's just interesting to me that it is a very human response to a very natural event to just find people, find your neighbors and help. So I don't know, I thought it was interesting.
Yeah. I said, let's put a for sale sign on it. We've got waterfront property at this point.
Oh,
That's great.
But don't you
Really?
think that, I'm sorry, but don't you think that this chapter goes along with what she's been saying, that, nature just goes on.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter, you know, the animals do what they're supposed to do, the water, things just keep pushing on. There's no stopping it.
Yeah, I think Thomas loved that passage. I'm not sure if you guys caught it, where she's describing what it would be like to be trying to like stand up in the river and getting taken down by it. Your whole body would be like filled with clay. And that is quite a vivid image of the way nature just keeps going on.
Yeah, she says, it's on page 153, she talks about one of the men commenting, you'd never know what hit you if you fell over and got in it. But if you survived that part and managed to surface, how fast can you live? You need a windshield, you couldn't keep your head up the water under the surface as fast as you'd spin around like a sock in a clothes dryer. You couldn't grab onto a tree trunk without leaving that arm behind. No, you couldn't live. And if they ever found you, your gut would be solid red clay. And yeah, it just sort of is a pretty humbling recognition that our ability, the pace at which we can sustain doing life, it just isn't compatible with the pace of nature when it, you know, is unleashed to do its thing. And so it's just physically, it wasn't even a question, how long can you survive, or how long will it take before you die? It's just like, how fast are you capable of living your life? You know, not nearly as fast as nature would require of you if you were truly at its, you know, caught in the middle of it. And there is this other moment that we kind of learned from it in a way, on page 158, when the storm comes and the floods are coming. Women are bringing coffee and mugs to the road crew. They barely made a dent in the tree trunk, and they're giving up. It's a job for power tools. The water's going down anyway, and the danger is past. Some kids start doing tricks on a skateboard. I head home. Just this sort of, oh, okay, the show's over, and we're just going to keep going. And so, on the one hand, it can be really arresting. It can take us over, and we can't survive it. On the other, we can very quickly just say, all right, what's next? That was interesting. Was anybody else struck by anything uniquely human about this sort of place conscious, place sensitive chapter? Anything else that's any sort of...
Really quick, I've got a comment in the chat. Stephanie writes, I was in the 100-year flood in another state and recall the acrid odor she wrote about and the immense power of the water and the rapidity.
Natalia, tell us about the image you have on this slide.
Sure. So I should have, I'll see if I can find the link for what I was looking at. It's like just like a scrollable slideshow that Roanoke City put together. So all of these photos of the flood of 85 that I have are from that. It unfortunately doesn't give the location for some of them. And so this one, I'm actually not sure. Maybe someone else can tell where this is. But I picked this one because I liked the people looking over the edge. This is very much the picture that I had in my mind of, it's just like the dads with their hands clasped behind them going, yep, like, what can you do? Everybody's just sort of gazing down at the river rushing past and the like large debris that she describes.
Is that possibly the Walnut Street Bridge, the old Walnut Street Bridge, before they raised it?
Oh, you might be right. That does kind of look like it.
I know, because our house was right near the Walnut Street Bridge.
Yeah.
I know, I was kind of thinking maybe it was Franklin.
No, I don't. Because
No.
Franklin's high to the railroad track. It's always been higher.
That's very cool. Thank you for sharing those images, because if you don't mind like sharing the link, I would love to read through that
I'll
slideshow.
find it again. I'll find it on my phone and share it in the chat.
Cool.
All right, we can, if anybody else has anything to add, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll keep moving on the slides.
I have just one thought to piggyback on some of what's been said. Can you all hear me? My microphone.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can hear you well.
For some reason, it made me reconfigure it, but right before this. the question about why is she driven to write such a human chapter? My thought as I was reading it was, first of all, it was short and I had the attention span of an ant. So I'm like, oh, it's my favorite chapter because I can read it faster. And because her writing's so detailed, sometimes I have a hard time hanging in there with her. So and the humanness of it really drew me, and it made me think we can't escape it. So all of her observations about natures, and I'm looking kind of at building her story, that this kind of comes in the middle, of the whole book. And it's as she builds, I think how interesting that she would choose now to kind of point out all of these beautiful details she's painted about nature. And by the way, we can't escape, we can't get away from the beauty, but we also can't escape the horror of it.
Yeah,
that
that's
does
so
seem
good
to be,
because
sorry.
No, I was just thinking how, I think up until this point you could, and I don't think this would be true, but you could think, nature is something that you go out into if you're an Annie Dillard type, right? Like if you have the time to do so and you want to. But this chapter reminds us that that's not true at all. Like nature affects all of us, sometimes in really profound and unexpected ways. So yeah, I appreciate that point. That's good.
Suzanne, please go ahead.
Yeah, Sherry, I appreciate that too, because I thought about the same thing, like why did this is like pretty much in the middle of the book and she brought in kind of a different perspective. But I just got tickled on page 154 in my book, first full paragraph. I wouldn't, how she brings in all of these past images that might be floating down the river. And it just made me laugh. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see John Paul Jones coming around the bend, standing on the deck of the Bonhomme Richard, or Amelia Earhart waving gaily from the cockpit of her floating Lockheed. Why not a cello, a basket of breadfruit, a casket of antique coins? Here comes the Franklin expedition on snowshoes and the three magi, plus camels afloat on a canopied barge. Like that just kind of plops in. To this kind of very present moment with all the things that are going on with the flood. And then she brings back all of these historical artifacts and images, and it just made me laugh.
Not in the 85 flood, but earlier, just generally living by a river. Our autistic daughter was about 3 years old when she began to really enjoy swimming. And I had her in the river one day and she realized she could pick up her feet and start floating. And off she went. She doesn't talk but we caught her, but some things that float down the river can be scary. The river goes to Harper's Ferry.
Never forgot.
I mean, children are regularly brought up in the book as like the human being sort of most innately connected to what she tries to explore in the book, seeing and being a part of nature and sort of the unthinking eye. So that's great. We've got a few more things to talk about tonight, and so I'm just gonna keep going. Now we're moving to chapter 10, fecundity. Ashley pointed me towards this picture that we've paired with the quote, "Fecundity is an ugly word for an ugly subject. I did not know aphids give live birth, and so here we have a photo of one, in case you missed the bugs from last week."
They give a lot of live birth.
They sure do.
All the time. So,
And they're all female.
yes, they just do that very young. Yeah, I thought that this quote was the perfect way to kick off this chapter. Fecundity is an ugly word for an ugly subject. And gosh, it is. And it's so funny because earlier when we were starting this book, I was just kind of paging through the copy that I have, and I sort of came to the fecundity, or just passed by the fecundity chapter, and I was like, why does she use that word? There's so many other words as a writer that I can think of that just are not so disgusting. But as you read through the chapter, you're like, oh, that's quite intentional. She's a writer's writer and she doesn't pick a word without meaning to. And so she's very much drawing attention to something about what she calls the egginess of the world, or the eggy world, that is disturbing to us. And so I guess I have two goals as we talk about this chapter. One is to say, like, why is that? And then secondly, to maybe say, what are we supposed to do with that? So I've got another quote on the screen that is maybe her first pass at giving us a reason. I'll just read it real quick. It's, and by the way, almost every quote, this chapter is so gross, but it's just filled with beautiful language. She says, I don't know what it is about fecundity that so appalls. I suppose it is the teeming evidence that birth and growth, which we value, are ubiquitous and blind, that life itself is so astonishingly cheap, that nature is as careless as it is bountiful, and that with extravagance goes a crushing waste that will one day include our own cheap lives, Henley's loops and all. Every glistening egg is a memento.
I love memento.
There you have it. Before I ask you guys a few things, I did want to just tell you a little bit about this image. I happened to find this one from the NOAA website, which is fantastic, by the way. Apparently they have a huge images archive of just about every sea creature you could imagine. But so Dillard just barely mentions sea coral in this chapter as a very prolific creature. And this is a picture of star coral specifically spawning. And I thought, oh gosh, I know it wasn't local to her, but she missed out on another creature that really illustrates her point. So apparently, and I looked this up because I just thought it was so interesting. I'll just read this. This is also from the NOAA website. About 3/4 of all stony corals, that's one, produce male and or female gametes. And most of these species are broadcast spawners. This means they release massive numbers of those into the water, and they do this to distribute their offspring over as large an area as possible. The eggs and sperm join to form free floating or planktonic larvae called planula. Large numbers of planula are produced to compensate for the many hazards, such as predators, that they encounter as they're carried by water currents. And the time between the formation of the planulae and the time it settles on the bottom is a period of exceptionally high mortality among corals. And so what you're seeing there in this image, apparently people who know about this or who live in areas where corals live, it's often described as a snowstorm in the water. Literally, the water is just filled with all these sperm and eggs that are trying to find each other. And in this image, you can see a brittle star, like a sea star, as fast as it can, grabbing all that stuff for itself. So it really is like a feeding frenzy or smorgasbord. And so that's why there's so many of these eggs and sperm kind of jettisoned into the water. So it is disturbing. So I guess my question for you guys, since Annie Dillard is kind of asking that we really look at the wastefulness of life, and how birth is given, is well, let's put it this way, and I have this on a slide and tell you if you want to show it. If blood is one of Dillard's most human chapters, fecundity is very much about the animal world, and it's probably one of her ugliest. It's filled with all these disturbing, horrifying images. And I want to know, why do you think this subject matter bothers us so much? Just eggs, but it is gross. What do you guys think?
I'm just going to jump in, and I'm just going right off the top of my head and haven't really thought about this very deeply, but I think we like to romanticize nature, and we like to romanticize human relationships and sex and all of that. And she just does this wonderful way of digging in and showing us like we have to be witness to the real honesty of what happens in nature on this planet that is floating out there full of life. And we can't romanticize it once she starts really digging in and giving us like the very gory, realistic details of fecundity. And that's just, yeah, those were just my thoughts without thinking very deeply about that.
Twyla, please. Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Hi, it's Twyla. I didn't know if
Yeah.
someone else was talking. Well, I think the thing that bothers, I think, humans the most is the mortality part of it, where animals, they don't really feel that hurt like humans do. And I think it was in this chapter that Annie mentioned that in the wild, it's a 50% mortality of all the birth. And certainly for insects that lay thousands and thousands, it's probably less than that. And it does kind of remind me of a current event. I don't know if anyone's following the eagles out in Friends of Big Bear Valley. And
Yep.
for the past 2 years, they laid eggs, but the chicks never hatched. And this year they had 3 eggs, and you saw the first 2 hatch, and then the third one finally hatched like 2 days later. And you see all the feedings and the mother and the father, Jackie and Shadow, feeding them. And then the whole area in Big Bear Valley over the weekend got 2 feet of snow. And the third one was already compromised and not the healthiest. And the chick didn't make it. And if you were on any chat feed, the devastation, where I think probably for Jackie and Shadow, the parents, they're like, we have a 66% mortality rate. They probably feel it's a win.
Yeah.
It is kind of the human interpretation of death and mortality that, bugs and insects and animals for that part don't care so much.
Yeah, Katie in the really quick, sorry, Katie in the chat added a really great quote that illustrates what Twyla just said really well from page 176. Evolution loves death more than it loves you or me.
Yeah. Okay. And it's
Sorry,
kind of
someone else was
requires-
going to say.
I have a comment if nobody else
so
is
yes.
going. Okay. Well, it's interesting that you put the barnacle larvae picture up there because she's got a quote or a statement that really stood out to me. What if God has the same affectionate disregard for us that we have for barnacles? I don't know if each barnacle larvae is of itself unique and special, or if we, the people, are essentially as interchangeable as bricks.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting thought that we're just one of literally billions and are not unique. But to my surprise, I actually thought back to a beautiful psalm from the Old Testament that I'd like to read just a couple of sentences because it's kind of a interesting, I think, counterbalance to that idea that we're nothing more than bricks and maybe the universe, that's all it thinks of us. So this is from Psalm 139. Says, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. And it goes on in that vein that there's many passages that God, and I'm going to say God in the more general sense, that there's a being that maybe in fact looks at us as unique individuals, not as bricks. Now, whether that's a human construct to make us feel better because nobody wants to be a brick, it could be. But I think that's one reason why faith and religion and concepts of a universal being are so powerful, is that they help to give our life meaning, that we're not just part of the great fecundity parade of life. And so I just thought, that was a counterbalance.
Well, it's funny because I think that's appropriate to talk about because that is where the tension comes from in this chapter, right? It's like, she actually even says, like, she's sort of forming this chapter as a counterbalance to what she introduces in intricacy, which is kind of this idea that there is a benevolent force or a creator that made something beautiful. And then she's kind of holding that intention with, well, like, what do I do with how bad the world seems to be, right? And I think that's why it bothers her so much. So it does feel like, I don't know, very appropriate seesaw for us to feel as we're reading this specific chapter. I think there's somebody maybe either waiting to get in or,
Oh.
Yeah. was there anyone else who wanted to share thoughts on maybe why this subject is so uncomfortable for us? Oh, yeah.
What really caught my attention in this chapter was the comparison about how we look at plants and how we look at animals. She talks about in New York City, we think of rats and cockroaches and all that sort of thing. And she ends that section with saying, acres and acres of rats has a suitably chilling ring to it that is decidedly lacking if I say instead acres and acres of tulips. So I just thought that was interesting, thinking about the different way we look at now granted, some plants are weeds, there's some plants we don't look at with love, but the way we look at animals and plants, I thought that was an interesting comparison that she makes.
Yeah, I will just throw out, so some of you guys might know I'm a tree steward, volunteer tree steward at the city, and so I do know a little about plants, and I would say that while it may not bother us as much as what she's talking about here, the world is just as competitive for plants as it is for animals, if not more so sometimes. It takes a heck of a lot of acorns to produce a tree, and all the little saplings are competing against one another for a very small space of light in that forest canopy. So it is a tree eat tree world out there too, but it doesn't bother us as much, which is kind of interesting. So as she points out. Can I throw out one other possible reason? And this might be a good place to switch slides, Natalia, for maybe why this chapter disturbs us. So I would suggest, and maybe it's the writer in me, that of course the subject matter is disturbing, but also why we're disturbed is because let's not lose sight of the fact that Dillard is a very adept writer. And she's using all of her writerly skills that she previously dedicated to making us see beauty in some of the previous chapters to making us see ugliness in this one. I think she's very muscular about that. And so I pulled out this passage because it's full of really fab sound, so just great use of language in the exact same way that you use it to draw attention to beauty. She's using it to draw attention to ugliness. There's great syntax, really strong verbs, fabulous alliteration internally and at the beginning of words where we usually see them. So I'm curious if anyone would like to read that out loud and just listen to them speak it out loud and hear it. That passage on the screen.
I can make it bigger and help you all.
Us in the room.
Yeah.
There we go.
I can read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The landscape of Earth is dotted and smeared with masses of apparently identical individual animals, from the great Pleistocene herds that blanketed the grasslands to the gluey gobs of bacteria that clog the lobes of lungs. The oceanic breeding grounds of pelagic birds are as teeming and cluttered as any human Calcutta. Lemmings blacken the earth and locusts the air. Grunion run thick in the ocean, corals pile on pile, and protozoans explode in a red tide stain. Ants take to the skies in swarms, mayflies hatch by the millions, and molting cicadas coat the trunks of trees. Have you seen the rivers run red and lumpy with salmon?
Isn't that great, you guys?
You can tell that she's a poet when you read it, because it has like a cadence to it, in addition to just like the language being really beautiful. Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I am also a poet.
I like hearing your sort of structural sorry, I'm missing the words. Clearly, I'm not a structural person when it comes to writing. But your point about just how it's structured, making it feel real and giving it like a rhythm, because I think I've said before that like the first page or two of this book I felt was very dense, and I was kind of like, oh no, what have I gotten myself into? And then you just get into like her rhythm, and I feel like she's just like running through her sort of inner monologue, and I'm just being like tugged along on a breeze behind her like a cartoon.
Yeah, it's interesting too to think about, yeah, flood in terms of just the inundation of water, and then fecundity, the inundation of propagation and disregard for how long and whether some things survive. And yeah, I'm just kind of connecting with this image of inundation, just completely, complete inundation.
That's the perfect word.
Mhm.
Well, I don't wanna skip too fast, but I do think there's like a lot in this chapter that we kind of already started touching on the tension or the crux, which might be your next slide, Natalia.
Yeah.
I kind of wrote, and by the way, I loved the two images you put together. That's
Thanks. I really liked that passage too. I think someone alluded to it where something about, yeah, our is every little barnacle larva, that why do, like, should we place as much value on it if we consider human or life in general as valuable as like a little baby?
Yeah, or I think she also says in the Ichthumon, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the horrible Ichthumon story. Just like this is a tragedy of like Greek epic proportions if we think that this creature is like as alive as us, right? So yeah, it's there. That point is there for the taking for us to kind of sit with and think about, for sure. I did want to kind of just direct us to a couple things that feel pretty important in this one. I really do feel like she's covering a lot of really critical ground for herself, at least in this chapter, really asking herself tough questions. So I just wrote, of all the sections we've discussed here, this one kind of brings us to that fulcrum around which she's been pivoting this whole time in her kind of light and dark, good and evil, like beauty and horror, kind of explorations in nature. And she introduces us to that point of tension I mentioned earlier that she seems very disturbed by, right? Which is either the world is monstrous, something about the creation is monstrous, or we, in our disgust at it and our kind of human or artificial morality, are in some way broken. And she kind of leaves us in that place of tension to a degree. So I'm curious if there were any other places where you guys saw where you're like, ooh, I don't know how to feel about this. Like, and you are also feeling a tension that's maybe never resolved. We have someone in here.
This, she says, all right then, it is our emotions that are amiss. We are freaks, the world is fine, and let us all go have lobotomies to restore us to a natural state. We can leave the library then, go back to the creek, lobotomized, and live on its banks as untroubled as any muskrat or reed. You first. I love when she said you first. And then she said, perhaps I don't need a lobotomy, but I could use some calming down, and the creek is just the place for that. Yeah.
Really funny that you bring that up.
I think this is where she leaves us, right? Is like, I don't think she resolves the tension for us, but I do think she softens it a little bit. Maybe gives us a softer gaze to look at it with, or some tools to live with it with. So, this is the quote we just read, perhaps I don't need a lobotomy, but I could use some calming down, and the creek is just the place for it. I must go down to the creek again. It is where I belong. I bring human values to the creek and so save myself from being brutalized. Again, great language, but also it's just interesting that like the place of salvation for her is the place of tension, right? It's like her human values are meeting nature there. So I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that or anything you wanted to share about that point of tension?
I think I just appreciate her honesty, you know. We can't solve all the problems, we can't correct everything. And that's just the way things are.
I liked what you said. Admittedly, I'm a little bit behind in the reading, but just her returning to the place of tension for comfort. It's almost like, at least this is my experience in my own life, when I'm avoiding something that's causing me anxiety, it makes it worse. It makes it this like bigger, more difficult to pin down thing. And so just kind of accepting things as they are and going to them and just like observing without trying to change it, eases that tension a little bit, even if it's still there. Like acknowledging it makes it a little bit easier to manage, I guess.
Yeah, that's so good. Any other thoughts? This is like such an uncomfortable chapter that I think it's worth asking, like, okay, so what do we do with that now? Or what do we take away from it that we think is worth being uncomfortable for?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. But I do like there's a quote on page, I don't know, it's my 178, and it's very short, but, our excessive emotions are so patently painful and harmful to us as a species that I can hardly believe that they evolved.
That's so true.
Yeah, but why do we have them, right? There's a reason we have them. Yeah. And that's right.
Yeah.
That's what to sit with.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, I don't know what you all think. I do think the proper response is to sit with it. Like that the counterbalance and tension is in some way useful to us, if nothing else. So I don't know. It's worth sitting with. And I do think it's kind of the heart of the book in some ways, this back and forth that she's stuck in here. So I don't know. It's pretty cool. Do you guys want to come up for air and go to the next chapter?
Let's go.
Yes. So let's move to stalking, which I loved this chapter. I hope you guys did too. I thought it was gorgeous and really fascinating. And I just thought we could kick us off with this quote. Does anyone want to read it? It's just so beautiful. One. Go twice. All right, I'll read it. So nature, said Heraclitus, is wont to hide herself. A fleeing mockingbird unfurls for a second a dazzling array of white fans and disappears in the leaves. Nature flashes the old mighty glance, the come hither look, drops the handkerchief, turns tail, and is gone. The nature I know is old, touch and go. And I have another great quote on the next slide. And I love the mockingbird picture, by the way, before we go, yes. And then occasionally the mountains part, the tree with the lights in it appears, the mockingbird falls, and time unfurls across space like an oriflamme. Now we rejoice. The news, after all, is not that muskrats are wary, but that they can be seen. So yeah, that's it. This is one of those chapters where the veil is, even for a moment, like pulled aside, and we get to kind of enjoy these deeper looks or more intimate looks at the natural world. So she introduces us to two kinds of stalking here, and I'm going fast because I have so many things I want to share with you guys. The via negativa, which would be like that intentional standing still so that the creature doesn't notice that you were ever there. And then a more active pursuit that might require an intentional or trained lack of self-awareness. So I'm totally curious because I've spent a lot of time in the natural world, but I have not spent any time hunting or doing anything stalking-ish where the animal world is concerned. I'm curious if any of you guys have really had any close encounters with animals or have really worked at being able to get close to them. I'm so fascinated if that's true and if this resonates for you. Anybody in the room?
I live in Grandin Village and I have a lot of deer.
Oh, yes, you do.
And I was just telling someone this the other day. One morning I walked out and there were two little fawns in the back of my yard, and I went and got my camera. They just stood there, and I went close to them and I took some pictures, and I said, you're welcome here now, but when you grow up, you cannot come back to this yard. And they just looked at me and then they walked on down the lane. Mother must have been somewhere, but you know, it seems like in the city, animals have become citified. I mean, yeah, I can take pictures of deer with antlers and, which out in the woods, they'd be gone. But here they've learned a different behavior. So,
That's very true. There are, I think maybe like the probably fourth or fifth generation of squirrels that live in my neighbor's tree next to my house that now know my dog and that he cannot get them, and so they have absolutely no fear. They'll be within like 2 feet of me as I'm taking out the trash.
What about the rest of you guys? Any of you all have frequent close encounters of the animal kind?
I will say, the last few years my husband and I have become somewhat birders. So particularly hawks in this area are plentiful in a
Mhm.
wide variety. So I like to seek them out, and woodpeckers. And again, they're plentiful here.
Yeah, they've been
Twilight,
busy.
chapter
Yep.
resonate?
Did
Did you
this chapter resonate?
recognize?
Well, I really like the muskrats. I really liked her story about sneaking up on the bank and getting within like 4 feet, and the only thing separating them were the reeds. So, so I enjoyed her clever pursuit, I guess.
Yeah. Katie's got her hand up. Please go ahead.
Just briefly, I've only ever had one encounter with a muskrat, and I thought it was really neat that she mentioned all kind of like the nemesis of the muskrat, because the only time I ever saw a muskrat was when a mink was chasing it out of its den. So I saw
Oh,
my first
wow.
mink and my first muskrat at the same time.
That's so
It was neat.
interesting.
You just happened to be there.
Well, it was my backyard.
Oh,
And I
wow.
mean, so that just denotes how hard it is to see a muskrat, because it apparently had been there the whole time, and I had just never noticed till its enemy approached or encroached its habitat.
Wow.
And it had to leave its usual sort of trails of where it did what it did all day long. And
And well, and the way she describes the water, and it kind of makes me think about those pictures you take right before like the seal of the water's broken on a swimmer. You know how like,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
that's exactly how it looked like, and I felt like she described it to a T. Like I could just see it in my head, just as I'd seen it that one time.
That's
That's so
wild.
interesting. Suzanne, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. So I live on a pond, and at this time of year, the Canada geese come in, and they are bullies, and they are big, and they are clumsy, and I could stalk them and probably get within 2 or 3 feet of them. So they're showing up on the pond, and then every year I also have a pair of not mallards and drakes, but they're little small wood ducks that are incredibly shy. So they nest really close to the bank below my deck. And if they sense that I'm on the deck or open my door, they are gone. So there is actually no stalking them at all because they are so shy and flutter away. And in contrast, the Canada geese will just march probably across my deck, across the dam, make a
Knock on
mess.
your door.
Yeah, knock on the door. And I'm always curious, and each year I'm curious as to how they coexist, because I think because the tiny wild wood ducks are so shy that the Canada geese are going to chase them away. But they both seem to find space here. So yeah, it's more observation, I think, than stalking, and curiosity about how that works, how they share space.
I think there's a hand up. It might be
Sure.
Sherry.
Yeah, Sherry.
Yeah, mine's, I guess, not stalking except for paying attention and looking. And and I'm seeing it more and more, animals that come, like, are drawn to certain people. And I would have never, by the way, 5 years ago believed this, any of what I'm about to say. But, when people talk about having experiences with animals, and several in the last 3 years, but the most absolutely amazing was we had moved to a place where my husband could get medical care he needed. And it still wasn't enough. And he was dying. And the last maybe 10 days or so of him being at home before he went into hospital, and then throughout his hospital stay, there was this toad that would hop and visit. Normally toads will hop away and frogs will hop away from you and sit at the sliding glass door every single night. And so I thought, it's visiting Tim. And then Tim went in the hospital and the kids were all here, and we would take turns going. And that toad was always sitting there waiting for me. And sometimes the kids would call and say, don't worry about rushing home. Like, we would take turns of who was there at what time. Don't worry about rushing home tonight, Mom, because the toad's not here and it's past the time that the toad's ever shown up. And I would get home and this toad would hop to find me and be sitting there at this sliding glass door. And I would sit out and talk to it, which my kids really thought I'd kind of lost my mind at that point. And kind of acknowledge its presence. And the interesting thing about this to me was I shared it with a friend of mine we've been friends for years. And without saying too much about how different we are, she is married to a PhD theologian. She's a lawyer. They're very, very conservative. He's a conservative pastor in the Deep South. But I'm saying because this story would have, I thought that she was really tracking, and her husband was tracking and there for us at this time. And so I said, you're not going to believe this. And I took a picture of this toad and said, he's here every night. And whenever I'm here, but if I'm not here, he doesn't come. And it was so lovely because she sent me this whole thing about I think it was a certain religion, not conservative Christianity. And she sent me this whole thing about toads are there to usher you over the threshold of life. From one place to the next. And I still have pictures of that toad in my phone from that time, and I journaled about it. So I also thought there's a commonality in nature if somebody of her kind of beliefs meets a friend, and that toad was meeting me, and then where she met a friend to kind of acknowledge that experience is just something that I'll never forget.
Oh, that's so
beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
My mother passed away last June, and at the church I go to, we buy Easter lilies for Easter, and then we take them home and I plant mine. They never bloom on Easter, but they bloom at some point. And my mother died on an early Sunday morning, and when I came home from church, all my Easter lilies had opened, and they're a sign of resurrection. I just thought that was interesting, that I felt like the plants were responding, just as some animals do. Yeah.
And I will tell you, my mother has a wren friend, and wrens are well known for liking people and hanging out near us and building nests near us, but that friend visits very regularly too. So yeah, I believe that some animals happen to connect with us for whatever reason. But well, before we close, I wanted to share one more thing with you guys, because I think it's such a nice dovetail with everything that Dillard has kind of set us up for so far. So many of you guys might know, I'm a writer and I help Thomas with his business. I do some visual art, but I also take photography, and I do actually get paid to do that, which I never planned to do. And I think that's kind of cool. But long before I ever made a dime doing that, I came to the world of photography through the lens, literally, of contemplative photography. And it is such a beautiful, perfect dovetail with a lot of what Dillard is teaching us in terms of both some of her stalking methods and that lack of self-awareness that you really need to get close to the world and see it in a new way. And also some of what she talks about in the seeing chapter that we've already said. So I just thought, oh gosh, I'm just going to share this with them, because I just know there's going to be some folks in the room that might enjoy doing this if they've never heard of it already. So, and by the way, I practiced this for years. starting in, I want to say maybe around 2013, and contemplative photography. If you've heard about it before, if for any reason the title is off-putting, you certainly don't have to see it as super serious or meditative. It does come to us by way of Eastern faith-based practices, but it can absolutely be used in a secular way, just as a way to relax or be more present in the everyday world. I think it's great for creative and artistic people. Those of us who live in this visual headspace all the time and maybe start to get kind of too distracted by all the voices telling us what ought to be beautiful or aesthetically correct. So anyways, let me just kind of share a little bit about what it is. So contemplative photography, I guess I tried to define it in the best way I could. It's a method of photography, not a style. And it's much less interested in the photograph as a product and more in photography as a process or practice of relearning how to see. And we kind of do that by shedding some of our unhelpful assumptions about what we ought to be seeing. And in fact, I love this. That last point is very true. A lot of contemplative photographers will even say that they don't take photographs. They receive photographs, which I think is so truthful if you're a regular practitioner of it. So what do I mean by relearning how to see? That might sound kind of funky. And by the way, all the images in this section are mine. So they are examples of what it could look like, but it can look all kinds of ways. This is one of those weird, cool, wonderful intersections where like spirituality, art, and science kind of all talk to one another. So when we're children and we're just little people and we're figuring out what's going on around us, and we see visually the world, we don't really know what we're looking at or what details are important. And so we're very curious and open, and we're just trying to figure it out. And we really do see the world a little bit more the way that it actually is. And as adults, we kind of form a more mental shorthand for a lot of things. We know what we expect to see, and so we just see certain outlines, and then literally, and science would tell you this is true, the brain kind of fills in just enough details to get by, and we miss a ton. And so the the practice of contemplative photography really does invite us to be present in the visual world, to slow down, to be really aware of our senses, and just take note of things that as adults, they just rush past us because we get busy in the world. And so I thought this was beautifully illustrated by actually a quote from our last chapter, our stocking chapter. And I think it's on your next slide. This is Dillard saying, "If I freeze, locking my muscles, I will tire and break. Instead of going rigid, I go calm. I center down wherever I am. I find balance and repose. I retreat not inside myself, but outside myself, so that I am a tissue of senses." I love that. "Whatever I see is plenty, abundance. I am the skin, the water, the wind plays over. I am petal, feather, stone." I love that quote. And I think a contemplative photographer would love it too. I think Dillard would have loved contemplative photography if she'd been a photographer. So this is just my just scratching the surface to introduce you to this idea. You can go and look it up if you're at all interested in it. But again, I do think that this practice is so life-giving, particularly for visual artists and creatives and people who just need to kind of slough off the skin of this is the correct visual image.
Can't we take a workshop with you?
Oh gosh, I would love to do that actually.
Okay, well,
Sign me up, please, because yeah, sloughing off what what is correct. I need that.
Well, I got to the list, and this book club's going to go on for 6 months.
Well, for those of you who cannot attend this imaginary workshop, I do have some very brief tips. Yes, there we go. So these are just a few, if you just want to try it out. And I would highly recommend, this is something you get better, and if you do it often, is just slowing your brain down enough to do it. But here's my tips for you: is just use whatever photographic equipment you have. I really do believe simplest is often the best. I'm such a believer in the best camera any of us ever has is the one that's on us when we are trying to be present. And so that might be an iPhone, and a lot of the images that you saw that are on these slides are taken with my iPhone, so that's fine. You're gonna just go for a leisurely walk, or you can just spend some time, quiet time in your own space. You can just watch the way the sunlight falls through the room if it's a winter day and you don't want to go outside. And you're just gonna kind of focus on releasing the tensions of the day and trying to really look at what's around you without worrying about finding a specific image. And I just always tell folks, if you experience mental chatter or distraction, that is totally human, and you can acknowledge those things without judging yourself about it, and then just release it and move on. And then once you've kind of done that, at some point, as you've given yourself space to be present in your moment, you're going to see something that strikes you. And this is on the next slide, Natalia. So contemplative photographers often will call that a flash, or maybe if they're a spiritual practitioner, they might call it a divine spark. I actually think this is kind of what traditional photographers are talking about when they call that a decisive moment. But here's the rub. So where a traditional photographer might be like, this is the moment, I've got to get the image right now. That's exactly where as a contemplative photographer, you do not do that. And you take a breath and stop. Or you use Dillard's classic stocking mechanism. You're gonna stop often and set frequent. So you just take a little time to really actually look at what's resonating with you. And then just see it in an honest fashion, not just what you expect to see there, but whatever it was that caught you. And last but not least, and if Natalia wants to flip our slide, I think once you've given yourself time to fully and really genuinely experience your flash, then you're at a good point where you can kind of step back and communicate it through the photograph. And this is the hard part for those of us who are formally trained in any kind of artistic field. You're going to focus less on what's artistically correct. So you're going to ignore a rule of thirds. We're not going to get sucked into whether it's a balanced composition. Instead, you just really want to focus on expressing an honest image that's your experience in the moment. It's kind of impressionist in that way, actually. And then my last tip, and I think it's maybe the best one of all, is just to expect happy accidents in this practice. Because I absolutely will tell you, many of the images that mean the most to me were ones that I could never have planned. They just happened, and I decided to take the invitation to stop what I was doing and be present in the moment and see something that was special to me. So if you at all enjoyed this, I hope you go Google it and look it up. There's tons and tons of different resources on how to be a contemplative photographer, and I think you'll enjoy it. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Ashley. This is really, really interesting. And I also wanted to point out this has a lot of overlap with the mindfulness that Suzanne walked us through that second week.
Thank you, Natalia. I was just thinking, and I'm just gonna, I don't want to put you on the spot, Ashley, but I'm thinking we might partner for on the 26th and
Sounds
combine.
great.
I mean, let's talk
I
about
mean,
that.
most of us will bring our phones, you know, so if
Yeah,
people want to try it.
As you're
I got it.
describing this, I'm thinking it's really a good partnership. So let's kind of put that out there, and I'll talk with Doug and Natalia and see if maybe we can make something like that happen.
Well,
I
I've
can
got to
send out an
confess,
email.
I gotta confess, I was on the phone with Rachel Ann, and we were talking about Rachel Ann's poetry, and we were talking about you, Suzanne, and Rachel Ann said, well, maybe Suzanne would want to partner, because she has a mind piece on the front end of
This is
hers.
a great party.
Yeah.
This is about partnerships, isn't it? This is why I love this whole experience. It's
Yeah.
about connection for sure. Okay.
Yeah. So we'll figure it out. I'm thinking it's almost that I am so happy about this. Wow, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, Natalia.
Thank you.
But that, the contemplative practice or taking some time before any artistic activity can be really powerful, whether it's sculpture or we might want to do a little series where we go out multiple times and weave in first the practice and then some exploration through different media. And we can use the catalog to do that. Ashley's in the catalog, Rachel Ann's in the catalog.
We do photographs and then do poems about the photographs.
Oh my gosh. Now there's a whole, our green spaces, our stories journal coming out. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I do want to reach out to the neighborhood and see the people who live right around that part and see if we can get some folks involved with this. If you're game, I'd love to keep exploring this in a fun way.
Sounds wonderful. Great ideas all around. I love it. Well, so speaking of which, I've got a little more information about if anybody needs those dates again for our meetups. I'll have them in the next slide. But as far as our next reading is going to be March 25th, same time, 7 to 8:15. And we will be discussing chapters 7 and 8, Night Watch and the Horns of the Altar, roughly pages 207 to 242. We don't have a guest guide yet, so if anybody is interested, at the end of the slide, I'll have Maya and Doug's emails. No pressure. I'm always happy to lead the discussion if necessary, but if anybody is interested, just give us a shout, and we're always happy to hear from you. So here we have the dates for our site visits, April 5th. Again, we'll have the exact locations and times for you, hopefully in the newsletter this coming week and also here in the slide next week. We'll have our creek workshop, and then the 26th will be that mindfulness walk, which maybe we'll have a photographic element if, again, no pressure, Ashley, you know, I know everyone's very busy. That's why we're still coordinating the exact times. But yeah, if you're able to pencil in any part of that day to spend with us, we'd absolutely love to have you. And as we're all becoming friends, maybe there will be more. So yeah, I see we've reached our time, so I'll bid everybody farewell. Thank you again so much, Ashley and Thomas. You really made this evening special. We really appreciate all of your work and everybody's insights. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. I really appreciated your stories, your animal encounters and the floods. So we'll see you next time, March 25th, 7 to 8:15. Happy reading, everyone. Oh, and here's my email. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
We'll stop recording.
Recording.